Welcome to this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. My name is James Williams, and today Vince Carter is getting his number 15 jersey retired by the Brooklyn Nets next season. This is coming after it was announced that Vince Carter is going to be inducted to the Basketball Hall of Fame later this summer. What we're going to talk about in this video is if Vince Carter has done enough to deserve to get his jersey retired by the Brooklyn Nets, mostly because he never played in Brooklyn, so it is kind of odd. We're also going to discuss if he should get his jersey retired in Toronto as well. But before we get to that stuff, I wanted to talk about how jersey retirements work, because we've done a few different videos on jersey retirements here, so we've done a little bit of research on this stuff. And just reading comments on Twitter and other places, it seems like a lot of people don't understand what it takes to get your jersey retired. So, for example, this isn't how the NBA works, but this is how college works. College works is it's like, hey, you have to hit these certain amount of goals or these certain amount of accolades and accomplishments, and most places will want you to get your degree, and that is how you get your jersey retired. It might be like, hey, we just need you to make an All-American team. You might need, depending on the school, like North Carolina, I think you have to get Player of the Year. And if you do those things, you get your jersey retired. So that's not how it works in the NBA. You don't have to be in the Hall of Fame to get your jersey retired. You don't need to be with this franchise for a certain amount of time. You don't need to hit the certain amount of accomplishments while you're on this said franchise to get your jersey retired, right? It is a lot more political, and a lot of times it is decided by the ownership group and, like, the board of directors for these certain teams. With that being said, too, some certain teams have higher standards than other teams. Teams like the Boston Celtics, Los Angeles Lakers, they have a little bit of a higher standard than the Memphis Grizzlies or the Milwaukee Bucks, let's say, for lack of a better team off the top of my head, or the Detroit Pistons or the Sacramento Kings. So I'm going to talk about the certain type of guys that typically get their jersey retired. Then we'll get to the Vince stuff. So really quickly, there is the guy that is a fan favorite, beloved by the fan base and the franchise, was played on the team for several years. A lot of times it is a guy that played their entire career there. An example of this is Tony Allen. Tony Allen is getting his jersey retired by the Memphis Grizzlies next season, but I mean, he did play for other teams too. He played for Boston, but he is mostly recognized as a Memphis guy, and the Memphis fan base really loves him. So he's getting his jersey retired next year. There's another type of guy that played for a team for only a short period of time, but was a part of one of the best teams in franchise history. This is the Shaquille O'Neal on Orlando jersey retirement. This is the eventual, I think this will happen, Kawhi Leonard, Toronto, 1 year in Toronto. There's the other type of retirement too, that since we've been doing ABA teams, there's a few that are like on this, that they were with an ABA team, like the Nets, Pacers, Nuggets, Spurs, that were on those teams when they got, incepted and when they were winning championships in the ABA. And those, if you go to those arenas, they have those type of jerseys retired. And then you have like kind of like the Hall of Fame guys that get their jerseys retired. The guys like Dirk Nowitzki that played for the Mavericks his entire career, Kobe Bryant on the Lakers, kind of get my drift there. And again, with those guys too, you don't need to win a championship to get your jersey retired. It is different when it comes to each team. Now, taking this back to Vince, because the reason we're doing this video is I just think it's incredibly odd that Vince Carter is getting his jersey retired by the Brooklyn Nets, because Vince Carter never made it out of the second round with the the New Jersey Nets. He only played there for 4.5 seasons. He didn't make any all NBA teams on the Nets. And honestly, his tenure with the Nets was pretty disappointing, because a few years prior, the Nets were coming off of back-to-back NBA Finals appearances. And the move to get Vince Carter, a guy in his mid to late 20s, supposedly still in the prime of his athletic career, adding him to Jason Kidd and what the Nets already had built there. The fact that, and we'll get to this here in a minute, that the Nets did not give up much stuff to get him is very disappointing, his time with the Nets. So the fact that he's getting his jersey retired for only being there 4.5 seasons is kind of confusing. He is the all-time single season points leader for the Nets, but this is something that is absolutely baffling to me, that this is happening, because I don't think it's warranted. Again, it would be one thing if they traded for him and then they made those 2 finals runs because of him, but he wasn't there for that stuff. His time with the Nets was disappointing. So he's getting his jersey retired? I don't know if the Nets in their whatever their franchise manifesto or whatever it is, maybe they have something where it's like, if our players ever make the Hall of Fame, then we will have their jerseys retired, which I think would be very confusing because does that mean that Kyrie and Kevin Durant are going to get their jerseys retired with the Nets one day? I mean, they played there about the same time as Vince did, had the same amount of accomplishments. And Kyrie and Kevin Durant are way better players. Well, at least Kevin Durant is all time than Vince Carter. Vince Carter, by the way, didn't make the top 75 all time NBA players, by the way. I want to make that clear because I think a lot of people overrate Vince in his entire career and they think it's a lot more accomplishments than what it was. But honestly, he's a guy that is his entire career was pretty disappointing. He's more noted for his his dunks in the Olympics than he is in any notable playoff game in his entire career. And I want to talk about this here too, because a lot of the comments I was reading on Twitter about this Vince thing were saying, well, wait a second, he needs to get his jersey retired in Toronto first. Toronto needs to retire his jersey. When's that going to come? Another part we didn't mention about jersey retirements earlier, because the videos that we had done about jersey retirements in the past, we did a video about Carmelo Anthony and talking about how he felt kind of betrayed by Denver that Jokic is wearing his number 15, and because of that, he's not going to get his jersey retired because they're not going to retire two number 15s in Denver. We talked about Paul George talking about wanting to get his jersey retired one day in Indiana, and I think this is the part of the Vince when we talk about his time in Toronto, and this is the point that we brought up with Paul George and Carmelo Anthony. How you treat the franchise, especially when you leave, matters. That matters. That stuff is very, very important because people are petty and people hold grudges. And people don't like it if you request trades, especially if you want to go to places that are more, grand and fabulous. So when we talked about Carmelo, it's like, hey, dude, you really kind of like ticked everyone off when you forced your way to New York. And now Carmelo's trying to do this thing where he's like walking back all this stuff. He's like, I never requested a trade, bro. And it's like, dude, there are literally quotes from your teammates talking about it and saying like, hey, man, we hope that he rescinds that trade request and comes back so he can play with us because we think we have a chance of winning an NBA championship. Those are quotes from like Chauncey Billups and other Denver Nuggets players during that time. And similarly with Paul George, we know that like, cool, he made a few Eastern Conference Finals runs with the Pacers, but those last like maybe third of his time in Indiana, he was definitely looking at going to LA, and we all knew that stuff. And then he eventually gets traded to the Thunder, and then he ends up going to LA anyway. So again, these teams, these fan bases, these franchises, they don't like it if you're going to request a trade. And talking about Vince and how it ended in Toronto, because I don't think a lot of people know this because there's not a lot of Vince Carter conversations about his career. Vince Carter did a James Harden. He did a James Harden. And he actually admitted that. You can go and look up the quotes. He admitted that he stopped trying while he was playing for the Raptors. He played in the 04-05 season. Well, let me look this up. I have it pulled up here. He played 20 games with the Toronto Raptors in the 04-05 season. When he played for Toronto, he averaged 15.9 points per game. He was shooting 41% from the field. He had 3.3 rebounds per game. His stats were absolutely terrible. And this isn't like a 3-game thing. This is a 20-game sample size. Well, middle of December, he gets traded to the Nets. His scoring average goes up from 15.9 to 27.5. His shooting percentage goes up 5% to 46%. His rebounds double, going from 3.3 or basically double to 5.9. Like he didn't care. He didn't try in Toronto. And because he tanked his trade stock so bad, the thing about Harden, every time that he, fattened up to get traded, the other team actually got a decent return. They got a decent return. This was the Vince Carter trade. They got like literally nothing. They got Alonzo Mourning. They immediately had to buy out his contract. They got 2 other guys that if I said their names, you would be like, who? I think you made up those names. And then they got 2 non-lottery picks that turn into nothing. So that completely screwed up the rebuilding process that the Raptors were doing around a young Chris Bosh. So it's not like they trade Vince for a bunch of stuff. They traded him for like nothing. And that is a thing that matters. It matters how you treat the franchise. So I don't think he's going to get his jersey retired in Toronto, even though you could make the argument that Vince is the best player to play for Toronto more than like 4 seasons. The best, like the most talented player, like with a resume, unless you wanted to, stack up the resumes of Lowry and DeRozan, and at least with Lowry, you'd have the championship pedigree with that. I'm not necessarily sure where their All NBA ranks off the top of my head compared to Vince's, but I don't think he gets his jersey retired in Toronto. I don't think he deserves it with the Nets. Vince too. I'll say this at the end. Seems like an awesome guy. Like he really does seem like a good dude. He comes across very well on TV. So I'm happy for him that he's making the Hall of Fame. He's getting his jersey retired. I just don't think it makes sense. And I think for what most people think a jersey retirement should be, this isn't it. The only rational decision that I could think that maybe the Nets are trying to have, like, Hall of Famers hung up in the rafters as like a weird psycho like way to like kind of recruit stars to come to the Nets, because the Nets are the, least relevant like team, like they're the least relevant they have ever been in New York since they've been in New York because of the Knicks' success this season. So that is one way that I could think them trying to, maybe they're trying to generate some good PR buzz. That's another thing that owners will do sometimes to like retire jerseys. Like this happened in like the 70s with I believe the Celtics in their current ownership. I believe that, I'm not sure if it was a jersey retirement or they were like doing something to honor John Havlicek. And the owner knew that the entire fan base hated him for a few decisions that he made. So he tried to like kind of like cover himself by giving John Havlicek like an award or a recognition or something like that. It didn't work. They booed the crap out of him, even with John Havlicek up there. And then he ended up selling the team within like the next like year or two or something like that. I can't remember the owner's name. This happened in the late 70s. But so maybe it's something like that where they, have kind of like screwed their team, by trading draft picks. And then, every move that they made, they gave up the 3rd pick this year to the Rockets for the James Harden trade, which is a terrible, terrible look. So maybe it's something like that. But I don't know. It's probably, as far as like my adult brain can remember with this stuff, it's probably one of the more odd jersey retirements that we've had. And again, too, it's not a again, I said at the top, I'll say it again. It's not a thing of like, hey, you get your jersey retired when you get the Hall of Fame, or it's the time you were the most accomplished in your career or something like that. Like I think Kevin Durant, or excuse me, not Kevin Durant, Kevin Garnett, his jersey, I believe, is retired in Boston. It is not retired in Minnesota yet, but it would make more sense for him to get his jersey retired in Minnesota. He's the best player to ever play for that franchise, won the only MVP that's ever been awarded for the Timberwolves, and played there for a very, very long time. I think he still holds several, if not a lot, of the Minnesota Timberwolves franchise records. So there you have it, guys. That's kind of my thoughts on Vince Carter getting his jersey retired by the Brooklyn Nets. Still seems weird. Also, the fact too, and I said at the beginning, the fact he never played in Brooklyn. So yeah, it's just completely weird. That's going to do it for this episode here today. If you've been listening to this episode this far, thank you so much. You're a real one. Help me out. Get me a subscription there in that lower right hand corner of your screen there. Subscribe to the podcast. It helps us out tremendously in the algorithm. Small channels like us need all we can get to get our stuff pushed down the algorithm. Hit that like button too. That also helps us out tremendously. And leave your thoughts on the Vince Carter retirement and even his career in general in the comments section. I'd love to hear what you guys think about Vince, because he does seem like he's one of those guys that is remembered more for his dunks than his actual play on the court and his actual accomplishments, even though he seems like a great guy. So there you have it, guys. Thank you again so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Thank you. I'll talk to you next time.